Good afternoon and welcome to the May meeting for the Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority. Unfortunately, ex officio members Mike Wood and Marita Kelly are unable to be with us today. Elaine is also unable to be with us, and you do not see Kathy, but she is with us virtually. Hi, Kathy. Next on the agenda is the approval of minutes, which I hope everyone has had a chance to review. I'd like to ask for a motion to approve the minutes for the monthly meeting of the ICA on April 26, 2023.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Sorry, I didn't ask for any comments. I have no initial comments other than to say we are still awaiting word on the 2020 audit, which we have again been told will be presented before the end of May. Not entirely sure how that can happen, given there's no meeting on the calendar, but we'll just hope for the beginning of June. I'd like to turn the floor over to Steve Fortner first, who will provide an update on the comprehensive software project that was launched last year and is working toward full implementation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to give you an update on the Operation Municipal Migration Project, which is our official name for the project. And it's basically a migration to the Munis ERP system from Tyler Technologies. And the scope of the project is to convert our three mainframe systems, which are city revenue and personnel, as well as our paychecks, payroll system, and the finance system. So we broke the project into 6 distinct phases. First will be in financials to get off the e-finance animation system, which we worked very hard last year to make that happen, and we were scheduled to go live January of this year, and we did that. So we were in very good shape thanks to a lot of work from Brian and others. We converted that one time. So during that phase, we converted 3 years of financial history, budget, and actuals. We did not do the details. We still have access to Penimation and will continue to have access through at least the end of this year. So if we need to reference anything, we have the ability to do that. Plus, sometime this year, we will create a bunch of reports, PDF reports out of the system that we can store on our network that we can access once Penimation is no longer available. So we still have that to do, but it is on our list to do. And as far as outstanding activities for that phase, there's 2 big things we need to do, but the first one is our vendor self-service to allow vendors to register, submit invoices, things like that. So we've done a little bit of work with that, but we have not gotten to the point of implementing that yet. And it's not something we had in our previous system, so we didn't lose any functionality because of that. And then the other big thing we need to do is convert our capital assets out of Penimation into Munis. So this week we pulled all the data off of Penimation because Brian was done doing the updating for the end of 2022. So we have all the data. It's a matter of going through figuring out what we do or do not want to import into Munis for future reference. So that's the big thing we've accomplished so far with the implementation. So we have 6 phases. That's the first one. The second one is human capital management. We are actively working on that one. Scheduled implementation for that is January of 2024. We had a little bit of a lull because our implementation coordinator got pulled off and put on another project. So we're going to get started with meetings with them and conversion activities sometime during the month of June. So we'll hopefully get back on track there. The biggest issue with that phase right now is tax reporting and filing, which Munis does not have that functionality. So we're debating whether we hire someone to perform that duty or whether we outsource that work to a third party, either a payroll company or an accounting firm. So we haven't made that decision. We haven't had a lot of discussion, but it is on our radar at this point. So That's the biggest issue that we see right now with that phase. The third phase is our real estate tax billing and collections. We are actively working on that phase as well. Scheduled implementation is October of this year. That includes both school and city real estate taxes. We have exported 20 years worth of data off our existing system. Tyler has run 2 passes of the conversion into a test environment. So we verified the first pass, we kind of went through and found some issues which they corrected. And now last Friday, they ran another pass of that data through, which next week or the week after, we'll then start reviewing that and making sure everything is accurate there. As part of our contract with Tyler, we only were able to convert 10 years, but the steering committee internally agreed to convert 20 years. So we have to pay a little bit extra for that, but the cost is not that great. So all of that is in the works right now. And as part of that phase as well, we have to design 4 new tax forms, 1 for city, 1 for school, and then the installment plan or payment plan properties that want to pay over the course of the year. So those forms have been designed. They've given us proofs of those. We've given them feedback, and they are working on making those changes to the form. So before long, we should be able to see that. And we've actually run a test city and school billing run in our test environment, and things are looking good there. So up until this point, a lot of activities as it relates to billing on the mainframe were kind of controlled by IT. With real estate tax billing, we're kind of delegating that to the Treasury office so that they can control the billing of those and not rely on us. Obviously, we'll be there to support them, but we want to kind of push the responsibility to them. And Tyler or Munis has a pretty good checklist of things you need to do in what order, and it won't let you go to the next step until you complete the previous one. So there's a lot of controls built in that should be easy for them to not have errors. It's going to have to back things out and start over. So we're in real good shape there. The next phase is licenses, permits, and codes enforcement. We are actively working on that phase as well. Right now, we're strictly focusing on business licenses. And again, the contract called for 10 years of history to be converted, and the steering committee agreed to convert 20 years of that data as well. So we'll have as much history as we currently have in the existing systems available within UNIS. There are some custom forms we'll probably have to design out of that, but we haven't gotten that far with that yet. And then the second piece of that is the codes enforcement. As far as data goes, they will allow us to convert as much data as we want to. So we'll pull off all of our mainframe data to import into UNIS. And we probably won't get started with that until around the September timeframe. And the scheduled implementation for that whole phase is February of next year. The 5th phase is utility billing and collection. We have not started on that phase yet, so we probably won't for another couple of months. We've got enough on our plate right now to get in place. So we're kind of left that one in a not started status. Back to the business licenses phase for a minute. There has been a little bit of a challenge figuring out how to structure the existing data into the format that Munis wants, because they have a standard template, and trying to figure out what we call one thing, they call something else. The terminology has been a little bit of a challenge. So other than that, we have been able to pull off as much data as we can for the 20 years of history. And then the last phase is asset maintenance, which is basically inventory and pick tickets and replenishing stock. We have started on that, just preliminary discussions, but that's a phase where we really don't have a lot of historical data. So we're going to kind of be building that from scratch. And we're going to start with Public Works and VMC to get their inventory into the system. So we're gonna get started on that one probably in June as well. And the scheduled implementation for that one is also January of next year. That's a lot of information. Any questions on any of that before I continue on?
Question about the payments. So will consumers be able to pay online? There's a direct interface with that? And then, so the same thing with permits, they'll be able to get their permits online, pay for them.
Correct. Yeah,
Right.
so today we have value payment systems out of Nashville, Tennessee, who is our credit card vendor. We can allow payments on things where we know what the exact amount is. And we send them outstanding files every day, and then they send us a payment file every day. Unis and value payment systems have a direct connection, so we'll be able to, in real time, figure out what a customer owes, and it'll be able to aggregate all of their accounts. So a customer can see everything within the value payment systems portal and make whatever payments they want to make at that point.
And Steve, that'll work for taxes as well.
The business taxes could be a little bit of a challenge.
Okay.
Because they have to fill out the form before they make, we have to approve it. So that's gonna be a little bit of a challenge. And we need to work through that one. Today, they cannot do that online at any point in time, so they have to write a check for that.
Or for example, their trash bill.
Oh, yes,
That'll
absolutely.
completely-
Yes, they can do that today and they'll be able to do that in the future.
Yes,
And real estate taxes as well. Yeah.
thank you.
So Keystone disappears. Management, aren't they the ones that currently collect?
We don't,
City tax?
we
What?
don't do anything.
Yes. Keystone writes the
Yeah,
EICL list.
Oh, okay.
Which we don't handle at all from that.
Oh.
They're kind of like a contract. For those taxes. So you handle real estate tax in the house now.
City and school.
I thought that's what Keystone was. No one saying that.
That can do all the computations on homestead exclusion, like that.
Yep. We get a monthly assessment file from Dauphin County. And we will then be able to import that into Munis. And then in June of every year, we get the homestead exclusion based on what the school district comes up with. So yes, we will be able to import that and calculate that exclusion on the school tax bills.
And on the capital module, does that allows you to include depreciation schedules?
Yes, it
And
does.
so then does that all wrap around to allow you to do future projections on capital budgets?
Yes, it does. And it'll tell you when something is scheduled to be replaced, so all that can be built into it. And it depends on how you set it up for each asset, so yes.
And does it go right from like a work order system and then or if it's capital account, it turns it into an asset?
Yes.
Puts it in an asset.
Yep, and you can check the boxes. It's a
It
capital
moves it to asset.
for purchasing, yes. Mhm.
Good.
So we established $5,000 as the threshold for what is capital and what is. Other questions or I continue? Okay, so our current project plan runs through about mid-2024, and that's obviously, if anything comes up, will be adjusted accordingly, but that's currently what we are shooting for. We have developed an internal timesheet in our Laserfish software, which allows people to report their time to the project, both by the day and by the phase. So every week we send a reminder to everybody, hey, update your timesheet. So through last Sunday, we've had 3,775 hours put into the project. And we kind of use a blended rate of $40 an hour. So that equates to a little over $151,000 of internal time that we've invested in the project. As far as budget and expenses go, right now, we've got $1.342 million in approved POs and contracts. Of that, we spent $862,690, and a little over 700,000 of that is for the annual SaaS fee. We paid our second year now, so a little over 100 grand in conversion costs. So we have 479,663 remaining in those approved POs and contracts. So at this point, we're projecting cost savings starting in late 2024, early 2025, and then continuing on from there on. And we've tried to keep the costs down for Tyler Resources by doing a lot of remote work. So we don't have a lot of travel expenses. So we had, obviously, there's times at the end of our financials implementation where we wanted somebody on site to help with the training and any issues we had. So we did have a little bit of that, but try to keep that to a minimum if we can. And with Zoom and Teams, it makes it very easy to do that today. And we do have a secure site that we use to put all of our data in. So we're not transmitting files over the internet. We're putting it in a secure site that they've established for us. Some of the challenges that we're facing, obviously balancing resource time between migration activities and daily activities. So far, I think we've done a pretty good job of that. I know Brian spent quite a bit of time on weekends during the financials project to get chart of accounts and other things in place for us. So there were some nights and weekends where we did have to do some work to get ready, but we were able to get through that. And then second challenge is making sure the data that we're exporting and converting into Munis is as accurate as it can be. I don't believe with the financials phase we had anything that was out of balance from the existing system. So I think that was a pretty good success. And then the third big challenge is any unanticipated disruptions, which I'll get to in a minute, but obviously we can't predict them and we can't build them into a schedule. And then longer term enhancements. One thing that's not in the current scope of the project is the Steelton trash accounts, which we are administering internally through a different system. So we're only spending about $8,000 a year on that software. So not a big expense, but at some point we want to get everything in one system. So that'll be a 2024, 2025 type project. So that's my summary of the project. Any other questions about that? And then I do have a couple of other things to mention.
Initially, I think there was an issue with the police feeling like they did not get what they needed. Is there a module that we can buy that makes their life easier? And I can't remember whether.
Schema scheduling.
Yes.
Complete schedule.
Yes,
Okay.
units, or Tyler has a module called Executive Time, which does advanced scheduling. We haven't gotten into that yet. The thought is it will be able to fit, but because both police and fire, their scheduling system is homegrown, there were probably some things they did that were outside the norm. So trying to fit that in, maybe a little bit of a challenge. I know police are looking at a system called Planet, PLANIT, whether they go with that or not for scheduling. And a lot of it has to do around subpoenas and being in court. That officers can see that on their schedule. That's kind of one of the issues that we've uncovered. So there may be some issues there, but we haven't got to the point of saying we have to do something different there.
And Steve, just to clarify, the tax that you mentioned, what was payroll taxes?
Yes, payroll tax.
Payroll tax,
And reviewing.
that might be a challenge that you
Yes.
might not fit into the munis.
Yeah, they don't have that functionality, and I know Reading was ready to implement the HCM functionality of Munis, and they put the brakes on it completely because of that issue.
Right.
And I did not hear what they ended up doing, whether they solved that problem internally or not, I don't know. But I did hear that's one of the things that kind of went down, stop it. think about it again.
I do think the the parking violations is really seamless because I got a ticket at, let's call it 3 o'clock, and I was able to pay it online at 4 o'clock. So
Is that a city
it's
system?
real
That's the
time.
parking.
Oh, that's
vendor.
the parking
Yes,
authority.
that's standard.
Standard
Oh,
parking,
well,
that's a
anyway.
contract. They
Okay,
spend a lot of money on their technology because it's how they make money.
Yeah.
And they're, I think they're nationwide.
Yeah, they are, it's very large.
Okay.
company, So,
But speaking of parking tickets, police are implementing the parking ticket system in June the 5th. That will not interface with any of our other systems, so they are, and that you will be able to do that with this system. You get the ticket, it's in their system immediately. You can pay it online.
are there other kinds of summons? Code enforcement does do summons.
Not that I'm aware.
Yeah.
They do citations.
Citations.
Yes, but that's the only thing that I'm there.
Hard to find one solution that literally does
Everything.
everything. You get close, then you've done really well.
So just a couple other comments I
Yep.
mentioned, unanticipated disruptions, as you probably know, back in January, we had water damage in City Hall, which impacted our entire floor. There was at least 2 inches of water on every inch carpet. Not, floor that was not carpeted, so it was just a mess. And through that, we lost one of our storage area networks to the mainframe. We had a redundant one. Fortunately, it was the redundant one, not the live one. So we weren't sure what to do. Everything was functioning, and we ultimately reached out to our mainframe vendor, Bear Consulting out of Denver, Colorado, and try to come up with a solution. And what we ultimately decided to do with the approval of City Council is migrate our entire mainframe platform to their data center in Omaha, Nebraska, which was the mainframe computing as well as the storage capacity. So we got started with that in February. The last weekend in April, we actually did that migration. We had the mainframe system completed down from 6 o'clock on Friday till about 6 o'clock on 6 p.m. on Saturday. So there were a couple of minor things that we had to deal with the following week. But last week we physically powered down our entire mainframe equipment. That means the mainframe, both of our storage units, our 2 physical tape drives, and a couple of other peripherals. So nobody knows any different than the data that they're accessing. It's not in the basement, it's in across the country. So that was the goal of the project, and that's what happened. So if we have a issue like that again, it doesn't matter from a mainframe standpoint because that equipment is no longer in City Hall. And then we also have our open systems platform, which is all of the network, our file server, or any of the personal drives that every employee has. We have currently redundant equipment in our data center on the lower level, but we want to move the redundant equipment to the engineering building on 7th Street. So we kind of have that redundancy at another location in the event we have this again. But with the water damage, that was the big thing we lost. We did lose a little bit of paper that we used for invoices and notices, things like that, but not a whole lot. But we also lost 10 PCs in our training room that was sitting on the floor, and power supplies just fried. So because we leave all our equipment in, so we had to replace those. But other than that, we're pretty much back to normal now. We had employees in 3 different rooms. We now have everybody in one room, redesigned the entire space, got new cubicles. So we just kind of moved in there last week. We have a brand new conference room, and we're in the process of setting up our training room again. So that should be functional within the next week or so.
It's a great conference room. I wouldn't mind moving down there.
So those are some of the disruptions we had during the month of well, from January through the end of May. And then one final thought, going into fourth quarter of last year, we were down 3 resources. Our deputy director, GIS administrator, and help desk and PC support technician. We hired GIS administrator in November, and then we filled the other 2 positions in early 2023. So we are now fully staffed. Things are moving along fairly well. We're keeping people happy with the requests they have. So all in all, I'm pretty pleased with where we're at in the IT system. And that's my report.
Thank you, Steve. Questions? Comments?
Just, since I had no questions, just to compliment you and your colleagues on shouldering a lot of responsibility and shouldering a lot of surprises along the way, and maintaining really critical function of what makes our city tick. Bravo. Good up. Look forward to seeing you again in 6 or 12 months.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Thanks for making the time.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. We will now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is discussing the updated financial chart submitted by the city on May 22nd. These are in lieu of an official wholesale update to the plan, which we approved September 2022. The next complete update will be submitted by August 31st, 2023. As I do with an entire submission, I request an opinion letter from the Controller's Office as to their assessment of the appropriateness of the projections made by the city. The Controller's Office focuses on the revenue. Their opinion, as was shared with all of you, was that the city is likely being a bit too optimistic, as their projection is close to the maximum revenue the city has received in the years between 2017 and 2022. They further suggest, according to a Bloomberg article, that the probability of a downturn in the next 12 months stands at 65%, based on a survey of economists. They suggest careful monitoring by the city and by the ICA so that expenditures can be modified if necessary. Finally, their opinion is that a quote legally adopted balanced budget should not include an appropriation of fund balance unless it is being used for non-recurring expenditures such as capital assets. I thought this was important to share to help frame our discussion after Brian McCutcheon of the city's finance office makes a few remarks.
Certainly.
Over to you.
All right, thank you. Audrey, good day, everyone again. I'm here pitch batting for Maria Kelly. And what Jeff just passed out is I tried to organize a little packet there, and down on the bottom right, I just referenced there's 3 pieces to that, and the A1, 2, and 3 is about the general. Where the A1 is the schedule, that is the overview of all of the years, including the projections. A2 is revenue detail, A3 is expenditure detail. The A4 is just a refresher on the city's debt. And I think you're much aware of the highlights there. And then lastly, A5 is the schedule we just recently developed on the neighborhood services fund to bring a better presentation to you on that front with some strategical ideas on revenue generation. So I'll start with if it's all right, I'll start with the general fund, the schedule, the landscape schedule. And again, Marita had worked on this for quite some time, getting you the update that you received back in April initially, along with our budget manager, and trying to put together a good update. I got a hold of it subsequently because I knew I would be coming today. I took a look at it and I just felt I knew the revenues on the projection years were too high. There was something off there, and there was a misinterpretation when they prepared it originally. They included utilizing fund balance as revenue, which really is not revenue. It's a source, And we put it in our annual budget as a source. It's not revenue. So I backed those out. And, you know, I went from there. What I'm gonna do, I'm not gonna go through all of these footnotes in detail, that A through G. I'd like to concentrate on the years. And in fiscal 22, the actual numbers there for the year, you can see the city ended up with a negative change in fund balance of 3.9 million. That, you might recall, mainly what drove that was the $12 million payment we did in December for the first prepayment on the AMBAC liability. So the city actually did a little over $8 million to the good when you factor out that 12 million that was paid to AMBAC as an extraordinary payment. Moving to the budget column for 23, again, we have revenue projected at 69.2 versus expenses of 79.6. And I get that by way of the expenses are on one line, but we also break out capital.
To the capital point.
Oh, so you add, okay, sorry.
The 2.2, that there's just to highlight what the capital anticipation is. So again, this year, currently, we're projecting a heavy use of fund balance of 10.4 million. Well, what that is, of course, is again, in March, we did the 8.3 million final payoff of the AMBAC liability. There's $2 million there for the incinerator matter, which is going through the litigation process, and they've had staff on site at the city going through a multitude of files. That this is coming from the law bureau, and the need is 2 million. We thought this would be an acceptable use of fund balance as well, because it could provide benefits to the city down the road if the effort goes in a positive direction. There's a small piece in there as well in that 10.4 of about 81,000, and it referred to what Steve mentioned about the offsite location of the mainframe hosting with Bear Consulting. We used a little bit of fund balance to accommodate that. So for 23, we're showing again, when you back out the fund balance, we have expenses matching revenue of 69.2 million for 23, which I think is a reasonable revenue target, you know, for this year. Moving over to 24, the revenue there, and that projection, it goes up a bit from 69.2 to 69.9. And as you mentioned, Audrey, and the controller does too, that's kind of a high optimistic end without any parking money, mainly the parking system revenue with the ground lease revenue and the priority payment. We don't anticipate any of that for next year. And it's doubtful. It's not. We're not looking even into the future years to estimate any of that, just because of the doubt. We're in these years, if things were normal, we'd be getting somewhere around 2.5 million, which if that would be the case, that would make our revenues much more in a comfort zone. That would be like up over around 71 million if that were the case. So again, for 24, there is a with expenses versus that revenue of 69.9, our total expenses, including capital, are projected to be 68 million, that's right in the sweet spot of budgeting your expenses based on what your reasonable take of revenue is. So I think the 24 column is quite reasonable. We move on to 25 and 26, and there's projections for 25 of a 1.35% increase in revenue. That takes it up to the 70.8, and then in 26, another 1.02% increase. So I think this is what the controller was getting at, about some concern about being optimistic to exercise caution. Actually met with the controller earlier this week, along with Dan Hartman, our BA, and we had a discussion too that Dan mentioned the idea that our EIT has been increasing and appears to be strong. And he's also looking at potential redevelopment projects over the course of these projection years, which might produce an increase in related real estate tax revenue. But I think it would be good to not, as we go into the next report that's due to you later this year, to reevaluate this revenue and to further consider it if we are being maybe too heavy on the optimistic side. The expenses, I'm sorry, the capital expenses for those 3 projection years, again, when Marita worked up her initial preparation, we had capital at 2.9 million every year. And that's what was creating the deficit spending that Charlie mentioned in his report. So I went back and I reduced those down to what you're seeing there for those 3 years. So what results, I'm showing positive change in fund balance for 24 and 25. 26, there is a little bit of a use of fund balance of 335,000, but again, that's related to the capital, which at times I think it can be viewed as a reasonable use of fund balance when you're trying to strengthen your existing capital structure. In summing it up, we end up with a cash position that approximates 14.9 million coming end of 2026. But I think the main thing too is to continue to monitor our macroeconomic effects out there, as Charlie mentioned about the downturn in his memo. To be mindful of that as we move into our next phase of 5-year plan. Any questions on that schedule of presentation?
Maybe just comment a little bit. I think the revenue projections, I don't think I could do it any better, honestly. I think the controller's comments were well noted. That said, it's tough to say sitting here in May of 2023 what the growth rate should be in 2025. I think a low growth rate, just for the purposes of a 5-year plan, I personally agree with that approach. I think it's probably the best, in my opinion, the best way to look at revenue over the next over the upcoming years for the purposes of planning. I think it should work at a high level for the city. So I would concur with that, and similarly with expenses. I think the thing as on the cautionary side, thing for me where I feel there's a point of emphasis has to do with some of the assumptions on growth in real estate tax revenue. I think I don't think it's a question of optimism versus pessimism. I think it's a question of unpredictability. The effects of interest rates on real estate, both on the development side and on real estate values, are real, and it's a huge part of the city's budget. So I think the thing to fear is unpredictable results in future years for the city. I think if there's really, this is nationwide and especially in Harrisburg, really strong real estate market in the residential multifamily category, and certainly true in the city. How does that get reflected in the city's budget? Well, there's obviously EIT and LST consequences, which are positive. And if it's done through redevelopment, there's real estate results, which are positive. On the other hand, the commercial sector there's definitely question marks as to what happens to the value of commercial properties, which make up a really important part of the city's tax base. So for my 2 cents, not that it affects what's shown on the charts, but I think come fall and every quarter when we're monitoring, I think closely watching the points that may result in unpredictable swings in the direction of real estate in the city, which are very, very tough to influence in the short term. So if we find ourselves in a situation where that category is holding us back as far as financial results, it's tough to make any short-term moves that will result in improved real estate tax collections, and not in the short term anyway. Anyway, long-winded way of describing the thing that I'm personally, fearful of, and want to share that with my colleagues here. I think the other important point is to emphasize, Brian, your point about the baseline capital expenses. And I think it's great as a planning tool to see what is affordable within the city's means currently as far as making plans for capital expenses. And I think it merits a lot, as it has every year, it continues to merit a lot more discussion as to long-term sources and uses of funds for capital planning for the city. Long-winded way of saying, I think this is I think these are fair and reasonable, and I think it looks good for purposes of tiding us over and carrying us through to the major update coming up in the end of the summer.
I think the expenses on, the expense line before capital are really in the reasonableness ballpark. And even if we would tamp down revenue a bit and going into 25 and 26, which may be, certainly worth considering, it would still be above these particular expenses that are being shown. Then we get to, okay, what's left for capital? And you can sort of try to, gauge capital based on that, not ignoring capital, because we certainly can't do that. You got to be mindful of that. And the other thing to note here on expenses is that we are using up our revenue in its entirety. We're not, and we just came away with, finally eliminating that geo debt last year, and now the AMBAC debt, of course. So that cushion that would, I think, was being expected of many people is not there. But that's, I think, more toward the idea of the city, pouncing more on needs that it can address now all of a sudden that couldn't be addressed previously because of the debt. But it's just it's something to be mindful of, I think, going forward, the future budget bill.
On the $3 million that's budgeted for discovery for the incinerator.
Oh, it's actually 2 million.
2 million.
Right.
Okay, but that is all from Neil's, Bruce's discussion. That's pretty much done and then the fall is the target for completion of discovery.
Yeah, I don't know, if Neil were here, he could give you the best update on that, but I know they've been working steadily, so I'm
The bottom line, we don't expect it to carry forward beyond.
I want to say the majority of that cost, I think, will be realized, come the end of the year. You're thinking, will there be any carryover like into future years? Is that, and we don't anticipate that.
Okay, and then to follow up on a couple of points Ralph was raising, the arc on real estate taxes and on the local services tax. I think both are still being touched a little bit by results code, office space utilization in particular, and whether that's going to trigger either a decline in new development or possible assessment appeals based on use values or conversion values over to residential. I think are probably trending. I don't think that's going to be a major factor, but it's still something to watch.
One that we talked about before, Doug, was the treatment of remote workers.
Right.
Temporarily classified as remote is one thing, but being a permanent remote worker has serious consequences on how LST is recognized.
Yeah.
So there's anyway to your point, there's really a lot of things here that could take a real curveball.
Are there any lawsuits that you know of, Mike, relative to cities trying to, like, Philadelphia is dying? I mean, when you think about their excise tax and now all of a sudden these remote workers are going to be saying, I don't work in the city anymore.
I'm not aware of any lawsuits. I think the response or to address that concern, it would really require legislative action. And there are both corporations and municipalities that are wanting to see legislative relief when it comes to a nexus with corporations having remote workers working at home in the state, and also from a municipal standpoint, the LST standpoint. I see that being addressed legislatively. I can have a question related to the funding for the litigation, the incinerator litigation. I was under the impression that the cost of litigation was being funded at least in part by DCED. Is there a funding source that's being streamed from DCED through the city to pay for that?
I'm not aware of that being a revenue source.
I think it's only the actual costs for the attorney fee litigation. I don't believe it's this discovery piece of it.
The internal cost for going through.
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean, that's my understanding.
okay. So the $2 million is to cover the city's costs associated with compiling the documents.
It's actually a combination. I think we have like 500,000 related to that type of work. And the other 1.5 million is a related legal costs for one particular firm that's involved with this matter.
Assembly redaction.
Yeah, I guess that going through all these files we have and identifying what is pertinent, what is not.
So that's just legal fees relative to the discovery, not relative to pursuing litigation against the defendant.
I don't think we're at that
Yeah,
point
okay.
yet to pursue the actual part of the pursuit.
Thank you.
And as was said, it can be seen as an investment if you believe that they'll be a positive resolution to the case.
That's the hope that the city will realize some type of benefit.
Back to you.
I'll move on, and just a quick touch up on A2, which is the revenue detail at the bottom. There is a mention about forecast years reflecting some minimal return of parking. I think we'll strike that because, again, my subsequent discussions with the controller's office and Dana, we feel like it's more prudent not to bank on the, even if it would be like 10% of that potential revenue. I'll move on then to A4, which is the long-term debt. General obligation debt section. I won't belabor this section because I think you're all pretty well aware of it. On these A4, this A4 series on page 1 is just a overview of the GEO debt history, a little brief history on AMBAC. Page 2 just reflects all those great zeros as far as what's outstanding on the D and the F bonds, and of course the forbearance liability is now out the door. What is still out there, and that is the next section, which is the Verizon Tower, Commonwealth Tower bonds, the bonds issued by the Redevelopment Authority back in 1998. And on page 3, which is a landscape schedule, you can see the value of those particular bonds at the top of the page at the end of last year. And the city doesn't really pay, in a formal way debt service, but we're required to contribute to the accounts that do service the debt, the redevelopment authorities account. So the third line down under annual debt service summary is what I'm referring to. And again, we just did our, this is our minimum payment contribution. We just did this $1,250,000 back at the end of April, because the first maturity on the bonds occurred on May the 1st. There's good news here too, that this is all we will have to pay, and because Harristown Development Corp also realized additional rent revenue based on their operations, which is very meaningful. It's in the $450,000 range. So when you couple that with our contribution and the monthly rent that comes in on the lease that's involved, which is $50,000 each month, that fully covers the debt service for the year, so. That's a good result for 23. And again, I'm looking at the 23 column. Shows what we just did for AMBAC, what I just mentioned on the Verizon bonds. And there's an older debt that we're paying to M&T Bank, and will be fully realized and done this year as well. It's a quarterly payment. We're just doing this week, the second of 3 payments this year, so we only have 1 more to go. So that's the old streetlight LED upgrade project that was financed. And of course, as you know, the city's not is prohibited from engaging in any borrowing still at this point. Which is a good thing that keeps our debt headed in the right direction. The last page of A4, it's just that brief update on audit findings. Audrey, you mentioned, I know the audit, I think you said 2020, and I think
I'm in
you
2021.
meant 21,
Okay,
right?
sorry.
Right,
yeah.
so we're, for the findings, and these are single audit findings, there's been some progress made on the one for segregation of duties. And that comes back actually to Steve and his crew in IT. There's a natural improvement there with what's happening with the ERP system. Because again, we're not, obviously not fully away from getting using the mainframe system, but as we're into the financial system is something running. And as we move forward with the HR side and more, I guess, relevant right now is the city treasurer system and the mercantile tax system. As that gets closer to being off of the mainframe, then that will produce a natural segregation of duties, because we won't have need to have adjustments made to the mainframe where you have sometimes need to rewrite programming that helps the mainframe function like it does. If I didn't say that,
Nope, that's good.
very well. Okay. And the other one down at the bottom is equipment and real property management. Initially, we thought this might be referring to our capital assets, but it really it's more, it is, but part of it is an inventory of like supplies, whether it's public works, office supplies. Part of the new ERP includes a module which is EAM, which is Enterprise Asset Maintenance. It sounds like it's talking about capital assets, but really it's meant for the inventory side. So that's something it's still in its very early stages. We haven't really had much training or insight on that with Tyler, but we had an initial kickoff meeting on that a few weeks back. So these findings aren't, again, that doesn't eliminate these findings, but at least we can comment to the audit that we're trying, we're showing progress to address. And as far as update on the current audit, Audrey, all of the adjustment entries have been now made. I've been working with in fact, I just talked to, by way of email today, my chief auditor and one of his staff members, and I'm hopeful they can get me a draft by the end of this week, because I need that draft is very helpful to me to move forward with what we put in the what used to be called the CAFR, the MD&A and the statistical section. So if I can get that by the end of this week, I plan to really strongly get that moving in the right direction. So and we anticipate also reaching out to the audit committee to update them and to give them an update on audit findings and of course the management letter as well.
Right, and when you do, if you wouldn't mind just reaffirming that in the past, we've had a joint meeting, so that before they schedule a meeting with the auditor, they can confer with us so that we can try and find the best date for all 10 of us or whatever will be. And because we don't have a chair yet, right, of the audit committee.
Okay, I don't believe, I know there's been some recent additions that have went through the nomination process.
And
Quite a few individuals.
I think it's 5, right? 4 or 5, and the city council did approve
They might pick a chair at their first meeting.
which would be this meeting.
Right.
So, but anyway, so you might be the one person that's our link here in these communications. Because
Are you saying, do you want to be part of that initial get together with them? Is that what this, with this
What-
board?
with the audit presentation,
Oh, from our auditors.
yes,
The
oh,
lawyer
sorry,
at Ritter.
yeah,
I
You like to come to that meeting?
to that meeting. I apologize. I followed you better now.
okay, sorry.
All right.
That was me.
Right, if I can continue on, the last item is A-5, which is the Neighborhood Services Fund. Schedule overview. So, the main thing driving this presentation would be footnote A. And what we say there, it includes various planned revenue enhancements. Well, what is that exactly? And with this fund, as you know, it's been a struggle to get revenue or to think revenue would be up to the point that could satisfy these incurred expenditures. So I was asked to, with Marita and Dan asked me to do a look-see on billing rate increases for Harrisburg accounts. So what we did, we looked at increasing the current rates at 6%, 4%, and 3% for years 24, 25, and 26 respectively. Also, to think about the 3 boroughs that the city services now, namely Steele, Pembroke, and Paxton. And to think about a similar increase that would be subject to, of course, negotiation. With Steele, they are actually coming up beginning in July this year with the final year. And it's already in the intergovernmental agreement. There's a scheduled increase of 4.4% in the quarterly billing rate. So I think that would just naturally flow, but we want to consider what's in store for the other 2 boroughs as well. Lastly, for generating revenue, the city brought back into its law bureau our professional attorney who focuses on the liens process and pursuing past due accounts or older balances. And also, I believe the law bureau hired recently a lien specialist to assist her with that process. So for these projection years, we are hopeful that we can realize another $350,000 annually that'll come out of that effort to try to make progress on these older balances. And as far as what that means for residents when it comes to increases in billing rates, the rates haven't changed for quite a while on residential accounts. You have to go back to 2008 when the current rate that people pay was implemented. And in looking at that, the 2008 rate and currently for both the monthly rate for both refuse and disposal is $32.34. And I mentioned those increases. What that means in the end, 6%, 4%, 3% come 2026. Their monthly bill would go from $32.34 to $36.71, based on those percentages on a monthly basis. Which is, I guess I have to be careful how I say it. I know I don't want to say it's not that much of an increase, but when you think about how long ago these rates were initiated, it's, I mean, like 15 years ago, there hasn't been an increase in these rates. On the commercial side, you have to go back. I think those rates have been in effect since 2013, 2014. Another item is a one-time item is footnote B for 2024. The city has secured the authorization to utilize the ARPA funds of $1 million to go back and satisfy trash accounts related to customers in need of financial assistance. So that's a one-time revenue source, which is why that stands out in 2024 and how that compares to future forecast years. Item C, footnote C is more about, that's the personnel line, and there's a built-in increase every year of 3%. And this year was finally the city has to address an MMO requirement for the non-uniform plan, which part of this fund absorbs. Because there are, as you know, several non-uniform employees that are paid out of this fund. So, and again, I think that was more a result of economic effects, a contraction, if you will, on the actuarial side that caused that reduction in funding to satisfy the pension plan. So we built in that to happen again, but at a reduced rate going into future years. So that's a bit of optimism. The last footnote is item D, and again, that comes back to capital for this fund, which is probably more. It's just as important, or maybe more important than any other city capital line, with maintaining the sanitation fleet when it comes to vehicles and equipment. So, and I think this was the struggle, you know, to say how can we keep funding, supporting, maintaining the city's fleet, especially when it's being asked to service more communities, and deal with a revenue source that's not, or that is a bit stagnant, and increases need to be considered. So that's the, I guess the force behind the revenue analysis to consider those increases. So given that, in this presentation, the cash balance does stabilize. With revenue increases, we allowed for a gradual buildup of capital in sanitation, while at the same time stabilizing that somewhat, well, that downward fall of cash that we've been seeing over recent recordings. That's my overview on that fund. If anybody has any comments or concerns, questions?
I think the percentage increases. I think that's the decision has to either be made to improve the revenue side and or improve the expense side in order to budget the balance. And I think it's appropriate to raise rates over time. They haven't been raised in 15 years. I think that's a good argument for it. I also think there's a fact that diesel fuel has had astronomical price increases unlike nothing we've had in recent history, and that obviously is a big expense with organizations that drive heavy equipment reliant on diesel fuel, and it affects the maintenance cost of the equipment as well. I wanted to add that I think that the amount of uncollected, gosh, I saved it from last month. The past due balance for amounts that have not yet been collected. Some of which is current, but the total last reported was nearly 12.3 million. Again, not all of which was past due, but a large amount. So I think something that we've never seen in one of these plans. I'd really encourage Brian I know it's not something you can just unilaterally do, but I would encourage you and everybody in the city to really push to find a way to recoup and monetize that past do that past due account, because that will flow back into fund balance where it's badly needed.
I definitely agree. We were seeing, I'm looking at the same thing you're looking at there, Ralph. Again, at the end of 2020, we had a balance of just about 13 million. And it started to trend down somewhat. It got down as low at March of last year to 11.5, down from 13 million. But it's crept back up in recent quarters to where it is right now. As of the end of March, you mentioned 12.3. One thing that's increased that a bit, the city began once again charging penalties at the beginning of this year. So that's certainly not all of the increase, but there is that aspect that's coming back into the billing. Where we are right now is around, when you do a collections versus billings, it's about 90% for both refuse and disposal. So that's down from where it was from a couple of years ago. It was much higher. It was well above 9%. But that balance still is lingering. So hopefully, as I mentioned about positions in the law bureau that will be focusing on that, we may be able to put a dent in that balance, finally start achieving some of those past due codes.
I'd really like to challenge you and your colleagues, especially come this fall on this submission. I'd really like to challenge you guys to just provide more in-depth study as to what it will take to make this fund not just skate by, but really be in a strong position to provide service going forward, as opposed to where we're at now, which is managing to account for some capital expenditure, but really not what's needed to be sustainable in the long term. And I think that is important. The other thing to note is also the collections rate. To what extent is the city able to, going forward, operate with a collections rate much better than 89% shown as of first quarter of this year. So those are some comments I think that we really need to make a team effort to build a plan around, and then start working and chipping away at it, monitoring it in upcoming quarters and years, to get to a place where everyone's proud of the fund. Do you have another comment regarding a suggestion for the plan for you coming up in the fall, which would be it's a larger accounting decision, and I believe you'd be wise to consider it, if not implement it, which would be to take the parks maintenance out of the neighborhood services fund, so that the neighborhood services fund it will relieve it of some of the pressure and from expenses which are not associated with neighborhood services revenue, and also give us a better picture of just the trash collection, which is really the business driver.
It's more of a public works type. It's interesting you say that because the meeting I had earlier this week with the controller, and in particular our PA Dan Hartman mentions that his thoughts were focused on that. He actually, I know you're saying, I mean, it's a significant part of this budget. Like I want to say over 2.2 million.
Yeah.
He was thinking in terms of maybe start chipping away at that, maybe between 10 and 20% of that budget and move it back to the general fund. Because we do have parks maintenance kind of go, when you hear that, it kind of goes to parks recreation and facilities, which is a single specific identifiable budget units within the general fund. So that he's thinking the same way, not the full amount as far as that total budget, but at least thinking in those terms to start trying to shift that away from services.
You would have the option to also make a parks another fund accounting. You could always break out parks and do a fund accounting with the parks and the parks maintenance being independent as well. It's an option to consider, but I think it would help better analyze the neighborhood services fund for the main business activity in it.
Certainly.
And last comment is just in the footnote A, and there's the penultimate draft included those percentages that you just presented to us, and then it was removed in this revised presentation in order to, I believe,
Wanted to generalize it, it's just
Generalize it.
because of the, I guess, the sensitivity about it would involve negotiations. Maybe when it comes to like the boroughs, the 3 boroughs, and how that would be. Like, I guess I'm trying to get away from saying, you know, this is how it's gonna be, because it may not, it may be something of a different increase. But the detail, I'm not trying to, you know, remove the detail. That's, that strategy is, it hasn't changed. I mean, those particulars I went through are meant to be what we proposed.
understood. I don't, and again, to reiterate, I don't think it's very controversial to raise rates over time for business activities. I think that's how the world works. But for our purposes as a board, I believe we're supposed to be able to demonstrate that there's assumptions that are used to generate the projection, that the assumptions are reasonable. So we have 2 ways of doing that. One is to actually list them here on your page, and the second way is for us to have them in our minutes or in our memo approving it. But we do need to actually account for what those assumptions are. Understanding that your description of those is not that you have approved them, but that it demonstrates the order of magnitude of what needs to be done in order to balance the fund, and that's your plan is to balance the fund. And then every year you have the opportunity to reassess and make adjustments.
And that first email, Jeff, I sent out, it actually has those details, and I mean, they're meant for your, to preserve for your.
I was gonna ask if we need another set of documents, because you were gonna change one of the other footnotes
Oh,
on
in the general.
the A2.
About parking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we could do one more. Well, send, if you want to change that, and perhaps before you do that, we can consider putting back the percentages.
Okay.
And then do one more send.
And send just those changes?
No, just send everything in.
Works.
Yeah,
Okay.
I like to have complete emails. It makes it easier.
easy.
Otherwise I get confused.
Okay.
I'm easily.
All right. Very
For
good.
my purposes, I don't have any objections to the percentages that are suggested. I think they sound reasonable on the face of it.
And I think that's the way I would encourage us to end the discussion, is that this is the document that's presented, and during the discussion, we learned the assumptions and they were reasonable, but not reincorporate them into this, which becomes a public document, which is then accessible to everyone, including other partners that will be part of the decision-making process in accepting these, and perhaps trying to avoid looking like the decision is made before they are engaged, if that makes sense.
So just the other.
Just to eliminate that one. quick minute.
Yeah.
Right, the one on the bottom. of the-
Yes,
Yeah.
it's the revenue.
Yeah.
That's
So that's not in the final public document. So you can-
Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
always. So if that ends that discussion, I think we need a motion to accept this submission with the one change that Brian will make and resubmit to Dan to serve in its entirety as the official 2023 update to the city's 5-year financial plan.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much, Brian, for everything you do. You do so much of this. And then I'll just call on you again to see if you want to say anything just about how the current year is stacking up.
Oh, for our staff.
No, sorry, the current fiscal year for the city.
I didn't bring, and I know matters here, but I did copy Jeff.
Yes.
For the last update. The monthly report.
Yeah, we got the actual December report.
Thank you.
That's what.
Yes. Yes.
And they did receive a copy of that.
And I did. Need a photographic memory. I did go, I added explanations in there, and I also do an analytical Excel schedule that defines some of the more notable changes. If I recall, the big thing that helped us through March and April, of course, was better timing of discounted real estate tax revenue. It's arriving at the normal time. Last year it was delayed because of the budget being delayed when it was reopened again. I do recall expenditures seem to be tracking fairly well within the general fund. In particular, March, we were right at, about 25%. And I think through April, it's a little bit,
It's
maybe a little bit more.
37.4, yeah.
And I don't expect, we shouldn't expect things to be, prorated perfectly, because our expenses don't work that way. And our revenue doesn't either, because we get some significant hits throughout the year. Pension in particular, when we get the funding that comes from the state aid, and also the city's $5 million annual contribution from the state for fire protection. I mean, those two amounts right there are a big chunk of our revenue, about close to $9 million typically. And we appear to be on a good track, but we look at the budget I look at it every checkpoint to make sure we're not exceeding anything at the major object level. I think the performance has been good through April. I think it will hold well, and we can use the mid-year report as a good tool, especially for updating, you later in the year on the 5-year. But I think we're in the process right now of doing a budget adjustment reallocation with council. It was actually just introduced last evening, and they're going to meet next week on Tuesday to have a combination work session and legislative session to review and hopefully vote to approve it. What that is different, that is different. Why it's different this year is that we're bringing into our expense accounts prior year encumbrances that were open at the end of the year. We didn't do that last year because we didn't want the current year's budget to be impacted. So we utilized a prior year, and it's a balance sheet account, a prior year encumbrance account to accommodate that. But when I was talking with, I communicate pretty regularly with Bill, the controller's office, and we felt like it would be better to bring these prior year amounts into expense in the current year so they're more visible, and they actually hit the expense accounts during the budget periods. I have to adjust them into expense anyway for the audits, in our audit full period 13. But we want to do that. But to do that, you have to also adjust the budget accordingly to plus up amounts to handle that extra expense. So it's always difficult to make this make sense in explanation, but the best way I can think of it is you always, when you get to the end of the year, you always have open encumbrances. In other words, you have amounts you thought would be paid, but they weren't. So they didn't go through expense, but they're sitting out there as open encumbrances. So they're going to be paid in the subsequent years, so we have to account for that. So that's what that's. But it won't. The idea is not to detriment the current year's budget. We would adjust it. We would adjust it accordingly. It becomes a prior use of prior year fund balance because it was cash that never got expended in 2022.
If you say it's good, we believe it.
Well, it's a preferred approach. I think it gives everybody a better sense that we're being as transparent as possible.
I think we're really happy to hear that. I think the way the distance you've come from when we first started working with you 5 or however many years ago it's been now. It's really just been steady progress year after year. So hopefully, look back 5 years from now and have even more accomplishments to be proud of.
I like the progress. Sometimes I'm not, it doesn't happen as quickly as I would like it.
Sometimes you have to look back over a period of 12 months to see how much you've accomplished,
Right.
and then you don't see it over the past 12 days or even
Yeah.
weeks sometimes.
And it's been, I mean, with the new system, it's been,
And encumbrance accounting is a big win.
yes. And everybody's subject, to the new learning curve with Munis, and that I'm still, learning as we go. And it is taking a while, but and Steve has been, I thank him, I hope I thank him enough, because we do encounter some roadblocks, during whatever it is, whether it's the revenue side, it's more on the expenditure side and the payable side, because there's just some things that are not quite yet. They're getting there, but they're not quite as smooth as we want them to be, so we're still working through that.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you again, Steve, for coming. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey.
Good business,
Yeah.
good business. Just really one item, which is our paid bills for the month. I think everybody received a copy of that. Our balance, as of today in our account is $141,408. And we have interest paid to date of $10.97, and we're fully up to date on all of our invoices. So where we're at, Madam Chair.
Excellent. So now it's time for public comment.
We have one person in the audience. Do you want to get down? Would you like to tell
Well,
us?
I want to say thank you to Brian for the birthday and the request that you sent out. I appreciate it. And sure the detailed information about the day was very.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here as always. Thank you.
I think we've gotten to the end, so motion to adjourn.
No moves.
And thank you all, and we will see you all in June. Can't believe it, half year.
5:23 p.m.